Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Benjamin Paz La Salsa wash processed Honduras from Heart Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Heart, based out of Portland, Oregon. And believe it or not, this is actually our first ever full bag review of one of Heart's coffees, which does lead to the question as to why we've never reviewed any of Heart's coffees in the past. And the main reason for that is because I've been waiting for a special moment or occasion to finally review them. As a coffee roaster I've had a long and extensive history with, being from the Pacific Northwest. Recently I have tried a couple of their coffees that I did very much enjoy. Couple that with the fact that they've gone through a lot of changes over the last couple of years, and it felt like a great opportunity to finally review them. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, I was honestly thinking a lot about what I was going to say on this part of this review, as Heart has gone through the spectrum over the years, as once upon a time they were one of the lighter roasting coffee roasters in the entirety of the United States. Some people I've even heard describe them as being on the more medium side of things, and while I wouldn't necessarily say that they're that developed, as they're definitely still lighter than a lot of the stuff I've had recently from either Onyx or Sweet Bloom, I can't necessarily say that they're the lightest roasting coffee roaster out there. And when I did mention that they've gone through a number of changes, I have noticed that some of their coffees have been turning out a little lighter, but this one on the other hand has been a little bit more reminiscent of the profiles I've had of their coffees in recent years, which is to say it kind of falls in the middle of that category where it's not necessarily the lightest thing out there, but even then it's not quite as developed as a number of those other American coffee roasters that I've listed as well. So I feel like the best place to align this one is being on the more traditional side of that medium light, in line with Heart's profile. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup is a slight bit fruit forward off brew. However, it does taper off pretty quick from that into a cup that is much more reminiscent of Kenyan coffees with a bright red fruit. There's a slight peachiness in the finish, but for the most part, it did have a pretty interesting start, as it was a little bit more reminiscent of Kenyan coffees for me. Now, the main reason that this coffee did catch my attention was because it was an SL28 from Benjamin Paz, and I fully expected it to be maybe a little bit more reminiscent of Kenyan coffees, but I did allude to a coffee that I had from Heart recently that I very much enjoyed, and that was a different Honduran coffee, so I was very curious as to how that might translate to this one. First impression, lending itself towards that Kenyan profile, and that was the same on day 18 as we opted for the Chemex, and it definitely had a similar experience with the slight fruit component, but much more of the classic Honduran profile, skewed with a tame Kenyan-like feel, softer red berry tones, and a subtle peachiness, so definitely reminiscent of that first impression. Day 21 through the April brewer, and the cup was notably better this time around, as it has much more of a prominent fruit profile in line with the listed stone fruits. Outside of that, there's a slight bit more prominent of a peachiness, still finishing in the classic Heart Kenyan-like sense of the red fruits, so it was better overall. And this is a great opportunity to discuss Heart's Kenyan coffees, as truth be told, the Kenyan coffees I enjoyed the least when I first started drinking coffee was Heart's Kenyan coffees, as I often found them to be a little bit more savory and tomato-like than any other coffee roaster. I really enjoyed Sweet Bloom's Kenyan coffees when I first started drinking coffee, but it was much more of Heart's Kenyan coffees that I had a little bit of an issue with, as they continued to turn out that way. And having this coffee be very reminiscent of those coffees wasn't necessarily the best experience. But we move on to day 24, as we opted for the V60 with Heart's recipe, and the cup does continue to accentuate plenty of those Kenyan-like qualities of the lingering red berry brightness. The peachiness still remains the secondary aspect in a slightly more subtle sense, with the majority of the flavor profile coming through in a long-lasting finish. Day 27 through the Chemex with Heart's recipe, and it's continuing to offer a similar experience to the previous cups, as it has that Heart Kenyan coffee feel in general, with a bit more savoriness to the cup in terms of the bright red fruit aspects. So the Chemex, especially with Heart's recipe, was really seeming to accentuate a lot of those Kenyan-like characteristics to this one. Stone fruit aspect is secondary, with plenty of those Kenyan-like qualities being dominant at this time. day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and I honestly felt like this coffee might just be improving with time. I was honestly at a loss on how I wanted to go about it because I said, I don't think lowering the extraction will necessarily help. I don't think pushing this coffee will necessarily help. I honestly just think that this coffee isn't necessarily for me. I think it's too reminiscent of what I usually experience from Hart's Kenyan coffees. So outside of that, there's still so much of that Kenyan-like brightness to it. And in addition to that, the savory Kenyan-like feel with much more of a focus on the stone fruit qualities this time around. A lingering herbal finish nonetheless. So, I mean, a lot of those Kenyan characteristics to it, especially for what this coffee is. We move on to day 33 through the Chemex, and there's more struggles to this coffee as it continues to remain on the more faint side of Kenyan coffees, with notably less of the fruit qualities and much more of an herbality. So I'm beginning to wonder, is this coffee becoming even more Kenyan-like than it already was? A bit more reminiscent of hibiscus and more of those red tones. And on day 36, the cup finally seemed to turn a corner as we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe. And it does have a stronger yellow-orange feel to it, so much more of those stone fruits. I can see a little bit more of the mango. I can see a little bit more of the peach. It's finally justifying those notes and also an abundance of orange and red tones to the finish as well. So I think that this coffee has finally turned a corner, and it's been a little bit frustrating because I looked at all those wonderful notes that they had listed on this coffee and I said, why am I not able to get any of those? But that's also reminiscent of the experiences I've had with their Kenyan coffees in general, as I'll look at them and they'll have maybe one red fruit note listed on there, some sort of currant, some sort of cranberry, anything along those lines, and then a number of other fruit qualities and notes. And I say, I'm not really experiencing those. All I'm experiencing is tomato. And with this coffee, I'm still experiencing so many of those savory aspects and savory tones. But this day 36 mark and this day 41 mark, I'm seeing the coffee finally turn a corner, and I'm finally starting to see a lot more of those fruit profiles within it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those. And we will start with the cleanliness level 4. And honestly, if I'm making this tasting wheel on pretty much any other day, I feel like it might have been a little bit of a stretch to put that at level 4, mostly because of just how much of those strong savory aspects were present within this coffee. But this coffee did benefit from the fact that on that final day, it seemed to have finally turned a corner, and I was finally experiencing a lot more of the expectations I had for this coffee. So level 4, I would say the majority of the coffee, not necessarily the savoriness, took away from it, but by the end, there's enough clarity to justify it's there. Finish, level 4. And yeah, it definitely has a lot of those savory aspects within the finish. Towards the end, when I'm making this tasting wheel, no, it has a little bit more of an herbal feel. It has a little bit more of a fruit-forward feel. But for the majority of this coffee, I continue to say it's doing very much in that heavy, lingering, savory sort of tomato-like feel to it. So level 4, yeah, with a grain of salt, most of the time I wasn't necessarily enjoying the finish within this coffee. Sweetness, level 4, it really surprises me that this coffee did finish at that level 4. I think that this tasting wheel, once again, does benefit from being made on a day where this coffee was significantly better than the majority of the days I was brewing it. As the majority of the days, it is at that level 3 mark. It is skewing in that Kenyan-like feel where it doesn't necessarily have a lot of these sweeter characteristics to it. So very lucky that it didn't score out that level 4, as most of the days it's also at that level 3. Acidity, level 4, that has been consistent throughout. That Kenyan-like brightness has always been a present component within this one. It is an SL28 coffee, so I think that's fully expected, and it was definitely presented throughout this coffee. Berry fruit, level 4. I can't quite recall whether or not they had any sort of berry note listed on here. I'm sure that they did. I'm sure it was something along the lines of a pomegranate or even a currant, because it very much had a lot of those red fruit tones to it, especially in that tart sense. It's very Kenyan berry-like within the entirety of the time that we were consuming this coffee, so definitely justified there at that level 4 mark. Stone fruit, level 4. I'm telling you, the majority of the time I was drinking this coffee, maybe level 3 if it was lucky, most of the time probably a level 2, because I was really not experiencing a lot of those peachy or mango-like qualities within the entirety of this coffee. So level 4 by the end, once again, it's a little bit of a miracle that it got to this point, because most of the days it's not even at that level 3 mark. All right. Let's go through those level 3s. We'll start with the florality level 3. On the day I made this tasting wheel, interestingly enough, it wasn't quite as hibiscusy, if that's a word, as it had been on some of the previous days. So it reached that level 3 mark. It could have definitely been in the level 4 on some of the earlier days, but florality, definitely plenty of it. It is coming in that more herbal red tone that's reminiscent of a lot of Kenyan qualities in general. Citrus fruit, level 3, and usually when there are a lot of those savory red fruit qualities, and I do experience a fair bit of citric tones to them as well. So that's what that is within this coffee. And then I feel like the final thing worth discussing is the body at a level 2. And that's pretty surprising to me because we are working with a Honduran coffee and an SL28, both of which tend to have a little bit more body. And I remember when making this tasting wheel, I said, okay, this coffee is somewhere between that 2 and the 3 mark, and I'm really surprised that it's coming out a little bit lower than I might have expected for what this coffee is. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel on this day and the previous day, I think it's a pretty good representation. But for the majority of the time drinking this coffee, I don't necessarily think it's a good representation. I've kind of discussed the changes I would make. But outside of that, yeah, that's kind of the way that this tasting wheel turned out. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I have to be honest, I'm a little disappointed that this coffee turned out the way it did, given the recent experiences I had with Heart. I felt like Heart had finally turned a corner to the point where I was enjoying them as much as I had in the past. Honestly, when I was first drinking Heart, I was really impressed by the way that their coffees were, mostly their washed Ethiopians. I think I've highlighted that in the past because they were the coffees that allowed me to learn how to taste floral notes within coffee in general. And from that moment going forward, I've kind of noticed that Heart has stuck in a pretty stagnant place, and it's been interesting to me that they've really seemed to go out there and become a lot more adventurous. They're tinkering with their roast profiles. They're tinkering with the type of coffee roasting machines that they're using. So I have a lot of optimism that they're trying to modernize and they're trying to become a lot more reminiscent of some of the more enjoyable coffee roasters. And that glimpse into the potential that they had with that Honduran coffee was very promising. And I thought, okay, if that was just a regular Honduran coffee, it was a Pacas coffee too, I can only imagine what they might do with something of this quality, something that comes from a very prestigious coffee roaster and a very exciting varietal. The combination of the two things turning out into something that I might very much enjoy. But it ended up being like the coffees that I enjoy the least from Heart, which was very Kenyan-like. And by the end, I could say it was a much more enjoyable coffee. And if I could have had this experience for the entirety of the coffee, then maybe I might be saying something completely different. But I have to be completely honest, for the majority of the time I was drinking this coffee, I was like, it's just a little bit too reminiscent of my least favorite Heart coffees in general. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I mean, that's the perfect place to go. If you do enjoy Heart's Kenyan coffees, I mean, this one's just a slightly fancier version of one of those Heart Kenyan coffees. It offers plenty of those strong, savory, red fruit characteristics to it. Also coupled by some interesting fruit components that are felt in a much more subtle sense for the majority of the time, but towards the end they do really seem to open up and give the coffee a little bit more depth in general. Nicer than average level of sweetness, pretty nice clarity towards the end. For the most part, that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Benjamin Paz La Salsa, wash processed Honduras from Heart Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.